What's up, everybody? This is Cyrus here with another video. Hope everybody's had a great week. And you are watching Afterlife Topics and Metaphysics, where we talk about a lot of exotic supernatural subjects. And tonight, we're talking about the standards of evidence and this fallacy of it's just anecdotal. So, to kind of catch people up to speed, especially if you're new here, I do paranormal research. I have a couple books out and a community online. Primarily I talk about life after death. I do work going out of my body, communicating with people who have kicked the bucket. I think it's a pretty important thing because it kind of makes you have to rethink your whole life, because you're now thinking about things in terms of not what am I going to do in one 75-year lifespan, what am I going to do for potentially like ever. So it kind of changes your perspective. I think it's pretty important for everybody. In this field, as having especially started out as like a younger person getting involved in this stuff, I quickly realized how aggressive the opposition is. And you see the same arguments coming up again and again, and many of them are quite weak. And you do have people in the media repeating these as well. It's just kind of like a smokescreen, right? So you hear the same arguments being repeated. People like Michael Shermer, the guy who was on Joe Rogan podcast recently, they kind of cover the smoke screen across the whole landscape, and people can't see through it, and they repeat these same arguments that are actually hollow. So there's very little substance behind the arguments to attempt to disprove some of these paratopics. So I'm going to get into that. One of the biggest hollow arguments that I've seen is that it's all, quote, anecdotal. And people who say this, I feel like they don't know what they're talking about. They don't know the definitions of these words or what standards of admissible evidence is really all about. So before we jump into this, a couple quick things. This will be one of the last times that you'll see this lovely background of a room I rent out in glorious Culver City, Southern California. I am heading off to Asia in just a couple days. Hopefully I'll get through the airport with this government shutdown. They're not sure how much longer TSA agents are even going to be on duty. So I hope I'm just kind of squeezing in. I'll get the heck out of this country before the situation gets any worse. And what else? I guess that's about it. So yeah, thanks for supporting the channel. Thanks for coming through and watching these. And please hit the subscribe button if you haven't done that yet already. It's the only way to keep these videos going and to keep tackling these really complex subjects. Alright, so let's jump into it. So up on the screen is a Quizlet test about admissible evidence in the US judicial system. So this stuff has been, it's not a perfect science, but in this life, what are we going to do about that? There is no perfect way to figure out if someone's telling the truth or not. So that's why we have to make do with what we've got. So the argument that all para evidence is just, quote, anecdotes, it's dismissing all of the areas of admissible evidence and swapping them out with only one criterion of evidence, which is scientific evidence. This is not the way that the legal system operates. Scientific evidence is one area of evidence. What's further ridiculous about this is that with the paratopics, there is scientific evidence as well. So again, often people just make these claims and it's a smokescreen. Michael Shermer does this, media skeptics do it, Neil Tyson does it, Brian Cox, a whole bunch of those people, Sean Carroll. All they're doing is just pumping a smokescreen out to the public, and you have to wonder what their motivations are. Who are the people who want to keep this information secret? The answer is almost every freaking government out there, because when you begin studying topics like remote viewing, you'll come to find that the effectiveness of an ability like remote viewing depends primarily on a smokescreen being set in motion so that the people who dismiss something like this from being real never take advantage of that technology, and then they become ultimately the people who get taken advantage of by the people who do use this type of technology. So it's in the interests of very powerful corporations and very powerful governments to keep a smokescreen going. So just keep this in mind next time you watch these types of people on YouTube or wherever else. So anyway, let me just go through some of the types of admissible evidence real quick and talk about how that can apply to what we talk about in this channel. So categories of courtroom evidence: oral witness testimony, real evidence, documentation, demonstrative evidence, stipulations, judicial notice. So let's go through some definitions. Oral testimony occurs when witnesses speak from the witness stand, take an oath to testify truthfully in responding to questions posed by attorneys representing both. There are three types of oral testimony witnesses: fact witnesses, eyewitnesses, expert witnesses, and character witnesses. So again, a very imprecise science, but it applies quite well to what we talk about, because this is the quote anecdotal evidence that people, the skeptics, attempt to dismiss as if this is the only type of evidence for these topics or people's testimonies. So if you take somebody who is a pillar of society, let's say like Eben Alexander, who had the near-death experience and wrote Proof of Heaven, and he had basically he had no brain function. There was like a meningitis type incident that happened and left his brain as essentially a bunch of empty meat. It was completely overrun by this infection. He should not have survived, has this massive near-death experience, talks about being in a forest and riding on the back of a butterfly with like this sister, I believe it was, may have been like a cousin. I think it was a sister that he had never met because they were separated at birth. Something along those lines. It's been a while since I read the whole story, but it's, it is a really cool book. But anyway, Eben Alexander, pillar of the community, comes forward, has this testimony. The last person on earth who would have an experience like this that he would just make up. He was a left-brained kind of atheist, materialist neurosurgeon. So that's a perfect example of an oral testimony of somebody who adds credence to the topic of life after death. Fact witnesses. Fact witnesses are witnesses who perceived facts related to the lawsuit and testify about those facts. They must be competent and have personal knowledge. This can really relate to topics about like mind extending outside the brain. So we have psychic detective work, where this is a whole field. Again, I can get into many videos about this, but we have detectives, police officers, investigators who can have testimonials about how psychics led them to the body, or something along those lines, help them find a key piece of evidence. These are facts that happened. If we want to say this didn't happen, then we have to cast shadow, doubt on those eyewitnesses. And the onus is on, in that case, I guess, the prosecution to have to somehow explain why a factual eyewitness testimony was inaccurate. So again, it's very, very difficult to dismiss that. Expert witnesses. Witnesses who use specialized knowledge or training to interpret evidence or explain it to the jury. They may be not required to have personal knowledge to testify. A great example of this would be this guy, Dr. Lloyd Rudy. So Lloyd Rudy here does a great YouTube video called Famous Cardiac Surgeons, Stories of Near-Death Experiences. He is an expert. He is like the video explains, one of the most famous cardiac surgeons. I believe he's passed away now, or left his body, as I like to say. But in this presentation, Rudy goes into talking about a phenomenal case where patient was able to identify everything that had been happening in the operating room after that patient should have been dead, was dead, and they were basically had him loosely stitched up because they were going to do an autopsy. He had died on the operating table and his corpse had been left there for a long time when he began to wake up again. And that whole time, the guy was outside of his body, watching everybody, and was able to recount all of that. Rudy here is able to testify about this as an expert about this that happened. This isn't just there's no courtroom in the world that would say, Your Honor, that's just an anecdote. Like, that's not the way civil society works. So if a skeptic debunker wants to use that argument, then they've already failed. It's just tribalism. Character witness offers information about the good or bad character of a party or witness. They do not testify about the facts directly at issue in the lawsuit. It's an interesting standard of evidence. I mean, look, I probably disagree with this as a standard of evidence, because somebody can be the best character in the world and, be somebody who could commit a crime. So, I mean, I don't really like the idea of character witnesses, but at the same time, even in this subject, that could relate as well. As an example, not everybody involved in psychic work is some kind of fraud, con artist, crazy person. Some people are, pillars of society, and their characters will testify to that. People involved in mediumship, for example. People I know who are mediums, people I know who are physical mediums, who actually produce like real tangible phenomena. Real evidence is physical evidence generated by the case. So this is interesting. Does that exist in this context? Maybe. It's tougher with this category because we are dealing with extra-dimensional phenomena. Certain types of physical mediumship, this could occur. If you go into the annals of parapsychology, back in the heyday, you'd have parapsychologists. I believe some of the ones who were investigating, like Eusapia Palladino back in the 1950s, I believe, taking samples of ectoplasm to observe it under a microscope and identify it, mostly being made of colorless blood cells. What else? What else could be real evidence? I mean, again, with physical mediumship, you have apportation phenomena when an object like falls out of the sky, lands on somebody's head, and it's of some significance to them. This is when like a alleged spirit is facilitating this and materializing an object in front of somebody. The skull experiments had a lot of crazy stuff like this happen. Again, crazier stuff, more in the annals of parapsychology, but it is out there if you look into it. Documentation. Documents are any type of writing or recording of information. It's really a subcategory of real evidence. Well, it's tough to say, because there is documentation about the existence of some of these subjects from very credible sources. As an example, the CIA website has something like hundreds of thousands of documents related to remote viewing experiments, and some of them blow the lid off the topic. Again, the skeptic debunkers, you won't see Michael Shermer citing that evidence because he knows that he'd be at a great amount of, he would be a great disadvantage to go up against that kind of evidence when you have the CIA saying, hey, we have remote viewers out solving national security problems. And how does remote viewing relate to like a topic like life after death and the stuff we talk about in this channel? It's part of a broader category involving non-materiality. And there's a different spectrum. Like there's some people who will say that they'll believe in remote viewing, but they won't believe in out-of-body experiences. They won't believe in an afterlife. But really, for most of us, we see that it's all connected. Because once you're doing stuff outside the body, outside the brain, everything else just becomes really just like a given. So you could definitely draw a line between topics like that. So the CIA confirms about remote viewing, and then if our minds are able to pick up information outside of the mind, outside of the brain, then everything else is extremely plausible at that point. Demonstrative evidence. Demonstrative evidence is evidence that illustrates and explains the evidence in a case. It can be physical, but unlike real evidence, it is not an object that played a role in the disputed events. For example, maps, photos, charts, experiments. I mean, look at just the experiments of Gary Schwartz at the University of Arizona. He has graphs, and I put those graphs in my first book, Understanding Life After Death, demonstrating experiments in spirit communication, such as the photon light detection experiments. So when the spirits were manipulating the energy in a sealed pitch black container based on a double-blind protocol, using a medium to determine when that they would activate and manipulate. You can see the graphs when the control group is very, very small. When the spirits are influencing it, it blows up like this. So we can show that in a courtroom. Some horrible pop-up ad here that's blocking the rest of this. We have stipulations. A stipulation is a voluntary agreement between opposing parties concerning some relevant point. I don't know how that would apply, but look, I think you guys get the point. So when skeptics say, "Oh, it's just anecdotal evidence," they don't really know what they're talking about. An anecdote probably wouldn't fall into any of these categories. You wouldn't see in a courtroom saying, "Well, that's just, Your Honor, that's just an anecdote." Like an oral testimony is not just an anecdote. And if a lawyer or prosecutor attempts to use that argument, then they're going to look like a very weak lawyer. Because you can say anything that's not scientifically verifiable is therefore an anecdote based upon that logic. And finally, there's one last point, which is that the type of evidence not included is scientific evidence, which there's a load of that in topics of non-physical, non-material phenomena. Just look into the work of Dean Radin. Go to afterlifetopics.com/destroying debunkers, and then there's like well over 100 peer-reviewed scientific experiments, most of them supporting all of these ideas. So the people who are still clinging on to the old paradigm, look, the sad thing is that it has the public support. So average people, average millennials, people who, again, watch, I hate to say it, Joe Rogan, listen to these guys like Tyson and Michael Shermer go on there and continue with that smokescreen cover-up. They're more popular because, same reason they've always been popular, because you get to side with them and point and laugh and mock at all the people who follow this stuff. And it helps you bond with other people. It's like, yeah, those psychics, they're all full of shit, and people can bond based upon that kind of negativity. It's easy to have that kind of temptation just to sit in the sidelines and point fingers and laugh. So yes, the court of public opinion, especially people in my age category, is not into this stuff. It's probably why this channel is growing kind of slowly. People don't like this stuff. But guess what? Even if you don't like it, it's all there. All the evidence is there. There's lots of it. There's scientific evidence. So, at some point, society is going to rapidly catch up to this stuff, and you guys who continue to keep your head in the sand, you're going to look like a bunch of idiots. History is not going to be on your side. Alright, this is Cyrus. If you like this stuff, you can check out afterlifetopics.com. Check out the Facebook group, my books, Afterlife University, which is a group for patrons of this channel who pledge $30 a month. We meet twice a week, and we go into really in-depth discussions. Some of that funding, like if I can get at least enough people who are patrons to add up to, I don't know, $1,000 a month, I can start funneling a bunch of that money into some projects that might be really cool. As an example, documentary filmmaking. That was my old thing, is doing documentary work. I always thought that would have been my trajectory, but documentary work, the film business, all that stuff. I moved out here to Hollywood some years back. I was just disgusted by the vibe, the types of people out here, the types of people I'd end up working with, just money-hungry predators. And then, there was the whole pedogate stuff that happened in Hollywood, and at that point I'm just like, I'm done, not going into the entertainment biz. But it's always been on the back of my mind that I'd love to go into the documentary filmmaking side of things. Imagine the kind of stuff that could be produced in this field, the kind of information that could get out there. So if you want to become a patron of the work, go to afterlifetopics.com/university, or just use the PayPal. So I always appreciate that, but if you don't want to contribute to anything, then just hitting a like or sharing the video, that helps me too. Alright guys, I'll see you all on the next video.